There is a moment in every royal court when the room goes completely silent, not because nothing is happening, but because something is happening that no one dared to believe was possible. This was one of those moments. The tiara had not been touched in 11 years. It had sat in a locked glass cabinet inside the east wing of Aldermere Palace, covered in a velvet cloth, sealed away like a wound that the kingdom was not ready to reopen. Everyone knew it was there. No one spoke about it. And yet, on a cold Tuesday morning in late November, Queen Margaret of Aldermere walked into the great hall carrying it in both hands, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that palace had ever heard. The kingdom of Aldermere had never been a simple place. Tucked between mountain ranges that turned silver in winter and green in summer, it was the kind of kingdom that looked peaceful from the outside and carried deep, old tensions underneath. Its people were proud. Its court was careful. And its royal family, for as long as anyone could remember, had moved through life the way chess pieces move, slowly, deliberately, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Queen Margaret was 71 years old, and she had been moving through life that way for decades. She had watched kings and queens rise and fall across neighboring kingdoms. She had buried a husband, a brother, and 2 close friends who had sat beside her at that very table in the great hall. She had learned, through all of it, that power does not announce itself with noise. It announces itself with precision, with timing, with the kind of gesture that changes everything without explaining anything. Which is exactly what she did on that November morning. Princess Charlotte was 23 years old and had been living inside the palace walls for just over 2 years. She had come into the royal family through a quiet, private ceremony, no grand wedding procession, no week-long celebration. The king, her husband Prince Edmund, had insisted on that. He did not like spectacle. Charlotte, for her part, had not minded. She was not the kind of person who needed applause to know her own worth. She had grown up in a modest home in the western provinces, the daughter of a former military officer, and she had carried herself with the kind of steadiness that cannot be taught in a finishing school. It either lives inside a person or it does not. In Charlotte, it lived deep. But the court had not been kind to her. That is the truth of it, and there is no softer way to say it. From the first week she had arrived, the whispers had followed her through the marble corridors. Too plain, too quiet, too common. The women of the inner court had perfected the art of the polite insult, the smile that did not reach the eyes, the compliment that carried a blade underneath it, the way they could exclude someone from a conversation simply by angling their shoulders away. Charlotte had felt every one of those exclusions. She had not flinched, but she had felt them. And then there was Lady Voss. Lady Alara Voss was 44 years old, the second wife of Duke Voss of the Northern Reach, and one of the most powerful presences in Aldermere's inner court. She had held that position for nearly 15 years, and she had not done so by accident. She was intelligent, composed, and deeply strategic. She understood how courts worked because she had spent her entire adult life studying them. She knew which alliances mattered, which grievances to hold quietly, and exactly how much influence she had built inside those palace walls. She also understood what Queen Margaret's tiara meant. The tiara had belonged to Queen Isolde, Margaret's mother, who had ruled Aldermere for 37 years and was still spoken of in reverent tones throughout the kingdom. Under Isolde, Aldermere had expanded its trade routes, ended a border conflict that had dragged on for 2 decades, and built the great library in the capital that still stood today. She had been, by any measure, the greatest ruler the kingdom had produced in living memory. When she died, the tiara she wore at every official ceremony had been placed in the east wing of the palace with a note from Queen Margaret herself. It will be passed to the woman who is ready to carry this kingdom forward, when I know who that woman is. For 11 years, that cabinet had stayed locked. Lady Voss had always assumed, though she would never say it aloud, that the tiara would one day find its way to her daughter, Lady Sarin, who was 26, educated in the finest courts of 3 kingdoms, and widely regarded as the most polished young woman in Aldermere's nobility. Voss had been building toward that moment quietly, steadily, the way she built toward everything. She had cultivated Margaret's trust. She had positioned Sarin carefully. She had been patient. She had not, in any version of her planning, accounted for Charlotte. The morning it happened, the great hall had been arranged for a small formal gathering. 30 or 40 people from the inner court, a few visiting dignitaries from the eastern provinces, and the senior members of the royal household staff. It was not supposed to be a significant occasion. There were no formal announcements scheduled. The gathering had been listed in the court calendar simply as a morning reception, the kind of thing that happened every few weeks and rarely produced anything worth remembering. Charlotte had arrived in a simple dress of deep blue, her dark hair pinned back, no jewelry except for her wedding ring and a small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. She had spoken quietly with one of the visiting dignitaries, laughed genuinely at something he said, and was in the middle of asking him about the flooding that had hit the eastern provinces that autumn. Because she had actually read the reports, because she always read the reports, when the room shifted. Queen Margaret had entered from the side door, not the main entrance. She was wearing her formal gray coat and carrying the velvet-wrapped bundle in both hands, and the moment people saw it, they understood. There was a texture to the silence that settled over that room. It was not the ordinary hush that follows a queen's entrance. It was the hush of recognition. Margaret walked directly to Charlotte. She did not make a speech first. She did not explain or announce. She simply stopped in front of her granddaughter-in-law, looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that what you are about to do is not impulsive, that you have thought about it carefully, that you mean every part of it. And then she unwrapped the tiara and held it out. Charlotte did not move immediately. She looked at the tiara, and then at Margaret's face, and then back at the tiara. She said something quiet that the people near the front could just barely make out, "Are you certain?" And Margaret's reply was equally quiet but utterly clear. "I have been certain for some time." When Margaret placed the tiara on Charlotte's head, the court erupted. Not in noise, there was no applause, no shouts. It erupted the way courts erupt when something shifts beneath the surface, when everyone feels simultaneously that the world they understood 5 minutes ago is not the world they are standing in now. People looked at each other, looked at Charlotte, looked at Margaret, looked with varying degrees of concealment at Lady Voss. Lady Voss had not moved from her position near the eastern window. She was still holding her teacup. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the person wearing them is working extremely hard to remain composed. Her daughter Saren stood 3 feet to her left and was not composing herself quite as successfully. There was a tightness around her eyes, a stillness to her body that read, to anyone paying close enough attention, like someone who has just watched something precious slip out of reach. Margaret announced, then in a clear and unhurried voice, that Charlotte would be formally recognized as Keeper of the Royal Legacy, a title that had not been used since Isolde's time, and which carried with it a seat on the Heritage Council, the right to speak directly on matters of culture and history at all formal court proceedings, and most significantly, the first consideration in the matter of ceremonial succession should the main line be without a suitable heir at the time of the Queen's passing. It was not, technically, a title of governance, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. Everyone in that room understood exactly what Queen Margaret was doing. She was not just honoring Charlotte, she was protecting her. She was drawing a line in the ink of royal record and saying, "This woman is mine to vouch for, and I am vouching for her completely." That afternoon, the palace moved at a different pace. The kind of quiet, urgent pace that follows a significant shift in power when no one is quite ready to talk about it openly, but everyone is talking about it in corners and over cups of tea in private sitting rooms. Lady Voss requested a private meeting with her senior advisor and held it behind a closed door for 2 hours. Saren left the palace grounds and did not return until evening. Several of the inner court ladies who had spent months carefully edging Charlotte out of conversations were suddenly, conspicuously, discovering that they had very warm feelings about her all along. Charlotte spent the afternoon in the library. This was not unusual for her. She had spent many afternoons there since coming to the palace. It was one of the few places where the silence felt comfortable rather than pointed, where she could read and think without feeling the weight of rooms that did not quite welcome her. She sat in her usual chair near the tall window and she read, and she thought, and at some point the head librarian brought her a cup of tea without being asked and set it down quietly beside her, and that small, unremarkable kindness made her eyes sting in a way she was not expecting. Prince Edmund found her there around 4 o'clock. He sat in the chair across from her and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "She told me last week she was going to do it, and I asked her if she was sure, and she said she had never been more sure of anything since choosing your grandfather-in-law as her king." Charlotte looked at him. "What did she say about me?" Edmund thought about it. "She said you reminded her of Isolde, not in face or in manner, but in the thing underneath those. The part that stays steady when everything around it moves. She said Isolde had that too, and it was the rarest quality she had ever seen, and she had spent 11 years waiting to see it again. Charlotte was quiet for a long time after that. The formal ceremony to mark the title came 3 days later, a small and dignified affair held in the palace chapel. Charlotte wore the tiara again, and this time she wore it without hesitation, not with arrogance, but with the particular uprightness of someone who understands that a thing has been given to them in trust, and who intends to be worthy of that trust. Margaret watched from her seat in the front row. Her face was difficult to read, which was its usual state. But the people who knew her well, and there were a few, could see what was in it. Satisfaction, relief, the particular peace of someone who has finally done a thing they have been waiting to do for a long time. Lady Voss attended the ceremony, as protocol required. She sat 3 rows back, on the right side, in a seat that placed her behind a stone pillar if you were looking from Charlotte's angle. This was not accidental. Voss was too precise a woman for things like that to be accidental. She watched the ceremony with an expression that revealed nothing, and when it was over she was among the first to offer a brief, correct congratulation and then remove herself from the room. She did not take any action that day. She was far too experienced for that. She understood that the moves that matter are rarely the ones made in the heat of the moment. They are the ones made quietly, 6 months later, when no one is watching closely anymore. She sat with what had happened and filed it away and began, in the private chambers of her own mind, to think carefully about what came next. Because Lady Voss had been outmaneuvered before. Not often, but before. And she had always found, in time, a way to rebalance. But that was a problem for another day. For now, in the kingdom of Aldermere, the tiara that had sat untouched in a locked cabinet for 11 years was resting on the head of a quiet woman from the western provinces, who read flood reports and asked real questions, and made the head librarian feel, for reasons he could not entirely explain, that the library was more useful than he had thought. And the queen who had kept that tiara locked away was sleeping that night without the weight she had carried since her mother died, the weight of not yet knowing, of waiting, of watching and hoping. She had known for some time that Charlotte was ready. She had been waiting, as wise people often do, for exactly the right moment to say so out loud. The moment, as it turned out, had been a Tuesday morning in late November in the Great Hall, with 30 people watching and a cold light coming through the tall windows. Simple, unhurried, precise. Exactly the way Queen Margaret did everything that mattered.